Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. In the narrow rooms of a workshop close to the harbor, the boy learned that silence could have a texture. It was not the silence of sleep or prayer, but of ordinary endurance. Sawdust falling in a soft rain over wooden floors, the faint breath held while a knife slid along a spine. The air smelled of spirits, faintly sweet, and of powdered glass used to polish the eyes of animals long dead. Each morning began with cold water from a bucket, and ended with hands that no longer felt warmth, only the thin rhythm of their own work. The master spoke little. He was one of those men who believed that knowledge was too expensive to give away. Commands were made through gestures, a lifted chin, a glance toward a tool, a tap against a countertop. The boy understood them all. Words were rare, so he learned from repetition. Cleaning a skin meant patience, slicing away what was no longer needed until what remained could deceive a gaze. At first, he disliked how the animals looked when finished, stiff, hollow, almost mocking their former grace. But over time, he began to see something else, the labor behind it. He came to believe that preserving a body was a kind of prayer for those who had no other monument. Stockholm outside the door carried its own rhythm. From the window, when he dared to look, the docks glistened. Carts creaked under barrels of salt fish. Apprentices from other trades shouted back and forth across puddles. Sometimes a noble's carriage passed through the street, splattering mud on the poor without a glance. The boy looked at such people with cautious curiosity, knowing that envy and anger were both dangerous forms of weakness. What mattered was steadiness. He had learned to bow slightly at customers, to repeat prices without hesitation, and to hide the tremor in his voice when a coin was pressed into his palm. Evenings came early in that quarter. Workshops closed with the smell of lamp oil and the slow cooling of iron. His cot stood near the back wall among crates of glass eyes and faded ledgers. A mouse occasionally rustled in a corner, and the boy would whisper to it, not out of affection, but for company. He imagined it listening, perhaps recognizing the weary tone that had no demand but acknowledgement. In those moments, the world outside seemed far away, the palace, the markets, the grand halls of guilds. Yet sometimes, when bells rang from across the water, he wondered what kind of life demanded so much sound. He had one friend, another apprentice from the tanner's yard. They met after work to share crusts of bread, dipping them into weak beer and talking in half-sentences about impossible travels. The friend was taller, quick to laugh, and dreamed of seeing Lapland or the New World. The boy mostly listened, smiling at the right times. When the friend left one spring to join a merchant ship, the workshop felt suddenly larger, emptier. The boy did not say goodbye at the harbor. He had stayed behind, preparing a stork for display. That evening, while smoothing its feathers, he found two small tears near the beak and stitched them carefully, as if tending to his own solitude. With the passing years inside that dim shop, the child's gaze sharpened. He learned to judge the freshness of a pelt by scent alone, to sense when a jar of spirit had lost strength, and to predict the master's mood from the weight of his footsteps. There was little kindness offered, yet no cruelty either, only the slow grind of necessity. On certain days, he imagined that the master, in his own way, felt pity for him. Once, when the boy caught a fever, a cup of hot milk appeared by his cot without explanation. He remembered it for years. Warmth given without words can echo longer than instruction. Sundays offered no church. Instead, he walked by the water, where gulls scolded one another and fishermen cleaned their nets. The smell of tar and brine filled the air. He often stopped before the statue near the customs house, a stone lion weathered by wind and rain. Its expression was both noble and weary. He liked that combination, and thought it would make an interesting subject for preservation if stone could ever hold life. The boy sometimes traced the cracks along the lion's mane with one finger, as though reading a message written by time itself. Superstitions clung to the harbor folk like salt. The taxidermist's trade invited unease. Some said those who handled the dead stole a fragment of their spirit. Others whispered that keeping the eyes of animals drew misfortune. The boy did not argue. Still, when a jar of eyes broke one evening and rolled across the floor, he made a sign of protection almost without thinking. Later, when nothing bad happened, he laughed quietly at his own fear, though he didn't tell the master. His humor, small and dry, became a private habit. When rats chewed through a sack of straw, he muttered that even they deserved comfort in winter. When an eel slipped from a customer's bucket and wriggled across the floor, he told it had chosen the wrong trade if it wished to escape death. Such comments never reached another ear, yet they kept him company better than silence did. Years folded over one another like pelts stacked in a corner. The boy grew taller, his shoulders broad from hauling specimens, hands scarred by blades. The trade had shaped him the way patience shapes wood, slowly, repetitively, until the grain learns obedience. But within him, a thin stubbornness remained, a curiosity not yet dulled by routine. When he worked alone, arranging feathers or stitching skin, his thoughts drifted to questions without answers. Why did men wish to keep the semblance of life so carefully, yet fear the living creature that once held it? Why did the dead, in their stillness, seem more honest than the living who passed his doorway each day? Sometimes, late at night, he lay awake, listening to the faint ticking of a wall clock whose pendulum swayed just beyond sight. That sound marked time more clearly than the daylight itself. He did not know what future awaited him beyond this room, but he sensed that his craft, so humble, so unremarkable, held a secret use. Preservation was not only a trade, it was a kind of attention, a refusal to let forgetting take everything. The thought soothed him. He fell asleep amid the faint scent of spirits and resin, dreaming of forests he had never seen, where things lived and died without witness. Outside, the city settled under frost. Candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows, and the masts in the harbor swayed against the moonlit water. Somewhere, a ship's bell rang twice, carrying across the narrow streets like a reminder that the world did not end with one's own breath. In the workshop, the boy turned in his sleep, muttering something he would not recall upon waking. The lamp above his cot burned low, painting the jars on the shelf in amber. Their shadows trembled, half living, half remembered, until the flame gave its last small sigh. The first workshop smelled of ambition and damp plaster. It stood halfway between the river and the old cathedral, tucked beneath the eaves of a building once used by sailmakers. The walls were cracked from frost, the window panes wavering like old glass that remembered too many winters. Yet in that narrow space, where daylight fought its way across jars and feathers, a new life stirred, quieter, but his own. He had saved long for the rent, counting each coin until the edge smoothed from handling. The previous master had died suddenly, leaving only debts, and for a few months the trade seemed to fade with him. The young man gathered what little he owned, a set of knives, a box of pins, a habit of silence, and began again under his own name. There was no ceremony, only the scratching of his quill when he wrote the first entry in his ledger. 4 sparrows restored, 1 weasel, 1 jay. Beneath the words hung both pride and fear. Clients came slowly. The hunters from the countryside, their faces red with wind, bargained harshly. Students from the scientific school brought specimens, frogs, fish, birds, hoping to impress their lecturers. Now and then a noble's servant arrived with orders from above, and the air in the workshop grew uneasy, for people in service never revealed their true masters. The young taxidermist met all customers with the same measured courtesy. To those of means, he bowed just enough. To those without, he gave a little extra effort for free. It was not generosity alone, but the quiet balancing of his world. Stockholm itself breathed outside the window. The markets filled with the smell of smoked meat and tarred rope, the cries of traders, and the chatter of beggars who invented stories to earn a coin. Prices rose with the thaw and fell with the cold. In the narrow lanes, the woman who sold ink greeted him each morning, and the blacksmith across the street teased him about the smell of spirits that followed on his coat. He replied once that some perfumes were more honest than church incense. The blacksmith had laughed, clapped him on the shoulder, and called him philosopher. Humor helped where pride would fail. People came to him not only for skill but for steadiness. When a young natural philosopher mislabeled an otter as a mink, the taxidermist, rather than correct him, merely smiled and said that nature enjoyed confusing even the educated. The student blushed, promised to return, and did. Knowledge, he learned, was a form of tact. Behind this surface of work ran his private worries. The rent climbed higher than earnings, and candles burned too quickly. He learned to cut them in thirds to make the evenings last. Meals were plain, bread dark as earth, fish cured in salt, sometimes an apple when business was good. He thought often of his sister, who lived with a distant aunt in the poorer quarter. Her letters came irregularly, written in slanted script that trembled between gratitude and apology. She wrote of coughing fits and the cost of warmth. He sent her half his income each month, never telling her what he went without to keep the envelope full. At dusk, the harbor fog rolled in and blurred the outlines of the city. From his window he watched ships rocking against the wharf ropes, their lanterns marking the slow pulse of trade. He wondered about the men aboard, whether they thought of home or only of profit. Often, he imagined his childhood friend returning among them, perhaps wiser, perhaps gone to the northern ice. Sometimes he told himself that hard work was its own kind of voyage, slower, perhaps, but no less uncertain. His hands changed that year. Where they had once trembled with youth, they now moved with a practiced calm. He shaped the air around his work as gently as the feathers themselves. Each specimen became more than commission. It became an answered question. A finch mid-song, a fox at rest. Fragments of stillness caught between life and oblivion. Observers admired the natural grace he gave each form, though none understood that it was born of nights without sleep and a careful study of decay. Winter returned, harsh and demanding. Each morning the water bucket froze before he could wash. One evening, while repairing the wing of an owl, the candlelight flickered and died. He sat in the cold, waiting for the wax to give a last glow, then finished the stitches by memory. Later that week, the widow who lived above him knocked at the door, asking for help to mend a broken chair. He fixed it without charge, and when she offered bread as thanks, he accepted, with a shy nod. After that, she came sometimes with small errands and gossip from the marketplace, whose child had married, which shopkeeper had gone bankrupt, when the river might thaw. Her chatter reminded him that life still moved outside his craft. One night, while returning from the apothecary, he crossed the square where beggars huddled against a frozen fountain. Among them sat a man who had lost his leg to a ship's anchor. The taxidermist stopped, handed him a coin, and received in return a smile so wide that it startled him. The man said, "Kindness is dearer than wine." He walked away quickly, embarrassed, yet the words followed him home. The next morning he found himself working more carefully, as though perfection might justify that fleeting praise. By early spring, his reputation had begun to circulate quietly. A visiting collector from Uppsala purchased 2 birds for a cabinet of curiosities and wrote a small notice praising a craftsman of uncommon patience. The line reached the local paper weeks later, though his name was misspelled. He read it by lamplight, both proud and mortified. Fame, he thought, is like a mirror fogged by breath. It reflects only while one leans too close. Still, there was satisfaction in the rhythm of days. He began to accept the city's tempo: deliveries at dawn, cleaning by midday, accounts in the afternoon. Sometimes he closed early, simply to walk the alleys and smell the thawing earth. Where others sought grandeur, he found wonder in small movements: the creak of ships, the echo of boots on wet cobbles, the swirl of gulls above the roofs. Such details, once ignored, became signs of continuity, small proofs that survival had its own beauty. But each morning as he opened the shop door, another layer of dust seemed to settle on his thoughts. The labor, honest as it was, began to press upon him with unseen weight. Work that had once felt noble grew repetitive, reduced to the counting of coins and the scraping of hides. There were moments when he envied the mounted creatures in his care. They at least were free from doubt. The first whisper of his sister's worsening illness arrived in a neighbor's letter. She had taken to bed with fever, and could no longer write. He traveled across the city to see her, through alleys thick with smoke and the smell of cheap spirits. Her room was small, her face pale in the dimness. She smiled when he entered, saying he still smelled of his trade. He laughed softly and promised her warmer seasons ahead. On leaving, he left enough coins for medicine and came home heavier than before. The next morning, he worked without pause, as if staying still might bring her strength from afar. Weeks passed. Her condition faltered. When news came of her recovery, partial but hopeful, he felt relief like sunlight through cloud. That evening, the widow upstairs brought him soup and bread. They ate in silence. She spoke of her departed husband, and he listened without interrupting. After she left, he sat beside the nearly finished fox on his work table and felt for the first time in years that companionship might not always demand words. By midsummer, his shop had grown into a quiet corner of the city's life. People began leaving small notes at the door requesting commissions. Children from the nearby dock sometimes peered through the window, pointing and whispering about the strange frozen animals. He let them watch now and then, enjoying their awe. It reminded him of his own first lesson in the old workshop, when wonder had come before weariness. In those days, the city smelled of lilac and smoke. Rumors of grain shortage spread, and tempers rose in the markets. Yet the evenings were peaceful. On a bench near the river he often sat, watching fishermen mend nets, the air soft with twilight. He wondered if success always required new ambition, or if contentment might be enough. The answer never came, but the question lingered comfortably, like a melody half remembered. Late that summer, as rain glimmered on the roofs, he sealed a wooden crate for delivery. 3 birds, lacquered and delicate. He paused before closing the lid. The thought came unbidden that he had, in his own way, learned to hold time still. Each creature preserved was a bargain with forgetting. Outside, the bells of the cathedral told the hour. He blew out the lamp, and the faint smell of spirits filled the room again, as it once had in his master's hands. For a moment he thought he heard the echo of the old man's slow steps, the faint crackle of sawdust beneath. Then the sound faded, leaving only peace and the low murmur of rain against the window. By the time the snow began to fall in wide, unhurried flakes, his reputation no longer needed introduction. The shop near the harbor had earned quiet respect, not fame, which seemed to him a dangerous current, but acknowledgement. Those who valued work done carefully found their way to his door. He had grown older with his trade, leaner, surer, and content to let the rhythm of daily labor replace the noise of ambition. Yet beneath that calm surface stirred a faint restlessness, the kind that accompanies a man who has looked too long at still things and begins to wonder what moves them. The winter market had drawn fewer buyers than usual. Ships stood frozen in the channel, their masts creaking under ice. He passed the days repairing old mounts brought in by collectors, wary of spending coin on new work. The nights he spent drafting letters he never sent, to his sister, now stable but frail again, to his scattered acquaintance among the craftsmen, to no one in particular. The ink dried before he found words worth keeping. Then, one gray morning, while he was sweeping frost from the windowsill, a stranger entered. The man's coat, stitched from fine dark wool, bore the faint smell of travel, horse sweat, and pine smoke. He carried a narrow chest covered in oilcloth and spoke with an accent that suggested education rather than trade. Without removing his gloves, he rested the chest on the counter and said only, "It is a lynx. Handle it with discretion." The voice was neither polite nor threatening, but the space between those tones made it memorable. When the stranger unlatched the lid, the smell of forest musk and cold iron spilled out. Inside lay a northern lynx, its fur thick and pale, marred by a single wound near the shoulder. It had died recently, the blood not yet blackened. He reached to touch the fur, and his fingers came away faintly dusted with what looked like gunpowder. The stranger noticed the gesture but said nothing. Instead, he drew a small purse from his coat and set it beside the specimen. The coins within were too many for such a commission. "Do not ask where it came from," the man said quietly, "and do not delay." He gave a thin nod, turned, and vanished into the whitened street. The shop returned to its familiar hush, though the silence now seemed altered, as if listening. He stood a long while without moving. Then, slowly, he removed the lynx and laid it on the bench. Its weight felt heavy in an unnatural way, not merely the heft of flesh, but the burden of a story that resisted telling. The wound was clean, cut by precision. Not an arrow, not the teeth of a trap. He bent closer and found tiny grains of black residue embedded in the fur. He scraped one into a dish. When held near the lamp, it flashed like soot mixed with metal dust. For 3 days he worked without pause, methodically cleaning, stretching, and curing the pelt. Yet concentration did not bring peace. The animal's face haunted him, the half-open eyes, frozen mid-defiance, as though startled by treachery. He told himself that mystery was none of his concern. Still, each stitch felt as though it bound him deeper into some unspoken matter. By evening, the docks stirred with rumors. Workers whispered of a nobleman's hunting party gone awry, of guards seen returning without trophies, of a missing servant rumored to have stolen something valuable. Such talk clung to the streets like fog. The taxidermist listened from his doorway but asked no questions. One night, unable to resist, he examined the chest again. Beneath its lining, he found a scrap of parchment fixed by resin. Its edges were torn, but part of a crest remained, a crowned elk within a circle of thorns. He recognized it from a distance, a northern family known for land and arrogance. Years ago, one of their stewards had ordered hawks for a private menagerie. That memory now returned with unwelcome clarity. He paused, staring at the fragment under lamplight. He knew enough to be cautious with such symbols. Nobility could vanish behind servants and reappear only when judgment fell upon others. The chest, once examined, revealed no more. He replaced the lining and resolved to finish the work swiftly, then forget it. Despite his decision, the lynx began to occupy his thoughts beyond reason. Its posture, once lifeless, seemed to demand acknowledgement. As he positioned the wire and cotton to shape it, he imagined the creature prowling through snowdrifts under pale stars, the same stars now hidden from him by soot-darkened windows. Each new layer of dressing felt like conversation. When he finally set the glass eyes into the sockets, he met his own reflection in their mirrored depths, a craftsman caught between reverence and guilt. The payment he had received proved more than he required for months of living. He used part of it to buy medicine for his sister, part to repair the roof that had begun to leak. Yet comfort brought no ease. The workroom grew colder, the light dimmer, and a strange anxiety began to follow him into sleep. More than once he dreamed of footsteps on the stairs and woke to find the door unlatched. Then came a brief thaw, accompanied by slush and the smell of river mud. On one such morning, while he was taking down a parcel of feathers from the shelf, a constable entered the workshop. His green coat bore insignia faded by duty, but still official enough to freeze the air. "You keep record of commissions," the man said, scanning the shelves. It was not a question. "Yes," he replied, and handed over the ledger. The constable traced the latest entries. "We are seeking a lynx," he said, "taken illegally from royal grounds. Hunters report hearing shots near the coast north of Sundbyholm." The taxidermist felt a tightening in his chest, but kept his tone level. "I prepare many specimens," he answered. "Often I'm given no history with them." The constable nodded absently, perhaps tired of repeating the inquiry. His eyes wandered over the mounted birds, the fox by the stove, the freshly finished lynx draped in muslin. "Strange creatures," he said half to himself, "almost as if they are listening." He closed the ledger, thanked him curtly, and left, leaving the faint smell of wet wool behind. For some time the taxidermist stood by the door, heart still quickened. He turned toward the covered lynx, but did not lift the cloth. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out upon the harbor, where ice cracked beneath the hulls of moored ships. The world beyond seemed unchanged. Seagulls, smoke, the cry of vendors. Yet within him something cautious had awakened, the awareness that silence could protect or condemn depending on who held it. That evening, as he locked up, he saw the stranger again across the square. The man did not enter, but lingered near the fishmonger's stall, his face obscured by a wide hat. Their eyes met only for an instant, but the message was clear. The work must remain unspoken. Then the figure turned, melting into the gray crowd of dock workers, as dusk swallowed the shapes of men and chimneys alike. Later, under the lamp's dim glow, he examined the wound of the lynx once more. Something in its symmetry suggested design, not accident. The thought refused dismissal. He pressed a finger against the stitched shoulder and whispered a question he could not repeat. Outside, the river groaned under ice, and the thin glass panes hummed in the wind. He poured a measure of spirits, sat beside the workbench, and watched the muslin rise and fall with the draft. In that wavering cloth, he imagined movement, the faint suggestion of breathing. Whether by trick of light or frayed nerves, he saw the animal's shape flicker between stillness and life, as though about to stir from uneasy sleep. By midnight, he roused himself, fearful of superstition, and covered the form with heavier cloth. The lamp burned low. When it died, he sat a while, listening to the harbor sounds, chains rattling, gulls moaning, distant laughter from a tavern. Each sound carried a new meaning, quieter and heavier than before, as if the city itself had chosen to guard a secret alongside him. And when at last he lay down, the air in the room remained alive with presence. The coins gleamed faintly on the counter where the stranger had left them. In his mind, their weight outlasted sleep. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind swept along the empty keys, and a shutter banged open, answering nothing but its own memory of cold. The spring that followed came late, reluctant and gray. Ice clung to the river far longer than memory permitted, and the wind carried the sourness of thawing earth. In that hesitant season, the taxidermist packed his satchel and prepared to leave the city. He told neighbors he was traveling north to procure specimens, which was true enough to satisfy the curious. Yet behind his measured tone lingered unease, the sense that he was walking not toward work, but toward an answer that might undo the fragile balance of his life. He set out by coach at dawn, the wheels breaking through crusted snow. The road wound through villages where chimneys smoked low, and children stared at travelers as if watching fables cross their thresholds. Each mile drew him farther from the clamor of the harbor, and deeper into a slower world of frost and timber. By the third day, the road narrowed into ruts between stands of pine and frozen marsh. He shared a final ride with a postman who spoke freely of northern estates and the stubborn ranks of nobility who claimed entire forests as their inheritance. "Men born under crests," the postman said, "see every root and animal as theirs by right. To step on their ground without leave is theft." The taxidermist merely nodded, though the words found a place beside the memory of the lynx's wound. He arrived at a settlement small enough to fit inside a single clearing. Wooden houses leaned against wind, smoke trailing from low chimneys. He rented a room above a tavern where the air smelled of yeast and pine tar. In the evenings, he listened to men tell stories near the hearth, of ghosts haunting logging paths, of hunters punished by forest spirits for arrogance, of a noble's guards patrolling the woods after some recent trespass. Their voices lowered when they noticed his silence. Outsiders were welcome, but not entirely trusted. The next morning, he began walking into the upland forest. Snowmelt pooled between roots. The air tasted of sap and iron. On occasion, he stopped to sketch birds or trace prints in the mud, professional pretenses that justified his journey. Yet his true focus lay farther north, where maps spoke of restricted land bearing the same crest he had found on the torn parchment. Locals avoided naming it aloud. Before midday, he met a woman gathering birch bark near a stream. Her hands were red with cold, her shawl patched. When he greeted her, she regarded him without fear, but with the guarded courtesy of one accustomed to strangers. She pointed him toward a ruined hunting cabin. "No one's lived there since the winter sickness," she said. "But you'll find answers in what's left behind." Her tone carried the faint rhythm of prophecy. He found the cabin hours later, half collapsed beneath its own roof. Inside lay fragments of tools, broken glass bottles, and a ledger damp with mold. The writing had blurred, but he could still discern lists of weights and tallies, far greater numbers than one household could have consumed. Among them, an entry that repeated the word lynx, followed by a mark resembling that same noble crest. The handwriting was fine and deliberate, a servant's precision rather than a poacher's scrawl. A sound behind him startled him, a twig breaking, a low cough. He turned, but saw only the forest pressing close, every tree a possible listener. Instinct urged him to leave. As he stepped onto the path, he felt watched, not by ghosts or spirits, but by the heavy gaze of property, invisible yet absolute. Back in the settlement, he spent the evening beside the tavern fire, pretending to read. The woman he had met earlier came in with a basket of herbs. She nodded toward him and said quietly, "That wood belongs to none who live here." Moments later, she added, "A man was found near the marsh last winter, throat cut." "They said wolves, "But no wolves leave a wound shaped like that." He thanked her and said nothing more. When he returned to his lodgings, he unpacked his notes, arranging evidence without realizing it. The scorched powder in the lynx's fur, the crest on the chest, the ledger's entries, the constable's search, this mention of a dead man. A shape began to form, indistinct but lethal. It was not the curiosity of trade that drove him now, but a strange compulsion toward order, the craftsman's same need to make fragments fit. Rain came that night, drumming softly on the roof. Unable to sleep, he opened the window. The forest loomed beyond the fields, breathing mist into the narrow valley. He thought of superstition, the tales of forest spirits hunting those who disturbed balance, and wondered whether guilt, even unspoken, could conjure its own apparitions. He closed the window, but the sound of rain remained like distant footfalls. 2 days later, he hired a boy to guide him closer to the restricted lands. The child led him along deer trails until warning signs nailed to trees appeared, heraldic emblems carved and painted in fading gold. Beyond them stretched managed woods, unnaturally uniform, each tree standing in precise distance from the next, as if arranged by decree. There he saw fences of iron and rope, and traps meant not for wolves, but for men. A faint odor of smoke drew him onward until he reached a clearing. In the center stood a new lodge built from heavy timber, its windows shuttered. A black horse grazed nearby, groomed too finely for a villager. He lingered only moments before realizing the danger of being seen. As he turned back, he caught sight of a figure on the porch, a man in a long coat, perhaps a guard, who lifted his head sharply at movement. The taxidermist stepped behind a fir trunk, waiting until the man retreated. Then he made his way through the underbrush until distance swallowed the lodge from view. By the time he returned to the settlement, the daylight had thinned. The tavern keeper poured him ale without question, yet eyes followed him again. Small village eyes, unused to secrecy, but knowing it when they saw it. That night he packed his things quietly, intending to leave before dawn. The woman reappeared at his door as rain began again. "You stir matters that sleep best undisturbed," she said softly. "Remember, those forests belong to men who do not forgive trespass." Her words stayed with him as he traveled back the following morning. The journey south seemed longer. Fields grew broader. Then stones replaced trees, until the soot of Stockholm's outskirts marked his return. The city, with its noise and steam, felt almost merciful after the watchful stillness of the north. In his workshop again he found the preserved lynx where he had left it. Under daylight, the creature seemed at peace, its posture noble, its expression calm. Yet now he could not look at it without recalling the forest and the ledger. Something about its halted motion appeared false, too perfect, as if the stillness itself were complicit. He ran a hand along the fur and whispered, "Nothing." Days slipped by as if the journey had been a fever dream. Still, subtle changes settled over him. He watched customers differently. When a hunter boasted of his kills, he observed the boast for what it was, a disguise for hunger or vanity. When a merchant argued price, he noted the trembling hands that betrayed debt. He had learned something of what power hides behind civility. The experience had sharpened not only his eyes, but his caution. Letters from the north continued to circulate through the city. An unnamed noble seeking craftsmen for taxidermy, rumors of stolen specimens, stories of servants dismissed without reason. Each rumor brushed against truth, but never touched it. He kept his silence, and outwardly nothing seemed changed. Yet sometimes, in the candlelight, when he compared the ledger pages from his journey with those from his own business, he sensed a thread connecting them. Preservation, imitation, ownership. Men, like taxidermists, disguised conquest as care. The thought chilled him more deeply than any superstition. One late evening he walked to the harbor alone. The ice had gone, ships swaying lazily against wet ropes. The city's reflection trembled across water dark as oil. He watched flakes of ash drift from chimneys and scatter over the surface before sinking. A superstition surfaced in his mind, that each ash found a soul unwilling to rise. He wondered whether truth itself could drown so silently. Returning home, he trimmed the wick of his lamp and placed his field notes in a drawer. He locked it and slid the key beneath the floorboard, not from fear of theft, but to avoid temptation. The lynx remained on its perch, glinting faintly under lamplight. Outside, a seabird cried against the wind. He had brought back no trophies, no proof of discovery, only the certainty that the still forest concealed something far more human than mystery. He sat until the oil burned low, then turned his chair toward the window, watching the city lamps blink against the mist. Even in their flicker, he sensed that all light, however well tended, burns at the mercy of shadow. And in that understanding, though he could name no reason, he felt both wiser and lonelier than before. Spring returned with uneven warmth, as if the world itself hesitated between endurance and renewal. The workshops along the harbor swept their thresholds clean. Merchants raised shutters. Soap water mixed with the sea breeze. Yet within his little shop, the air felt unchanged, heavy with the scent of resin and spirit. The taxidermist had come back from the northern forests months earlier, but his thoughts lingered there still, pacing among birch shadows that never reached daylight. He resumed work without complaint. Orders flowed again, songbirds from collectors, foxes from trappers, a young heron with wings broken by storm. Yet each movement of his knife felt different, stripped of its old calm. Every layer of skin lifted from the bone revealed not the mystery of preservation, but the weight of concealment. The lynx, finished and mounted before his departure, stood in the corner beneath a dustcloth. He kept it covered, though sometimes he caught himself staring at its outline, as if expecting breath beneath the muslin. Letters came and went. His sister's hand grew weaker, her words slower. The illness that had retreated now whispered of its return. She wrote of coughing fits, of the kindness of a neighbor who brought broth when the weather turned, and of dreams filled with forests she had never seen. He answered faithfully, describing his routine in simple phrases that spoke of stability, never of curiosity or fear. Beneath those careful sentences, another letter always began to form, one he would never send. Those pages, written after work and folded neatly, held sketches of what he had found in the north: the cabin, the crest, the guarded silence of the woods. When dawn came, he slid them into a box beside the window and told himself that saving truth in words was safer than releasing it aloud. Stockholm moved with its usual contradictions. Nobles rode through market squares indifferent to the price of bread. Carpenters argued with dockers about wages. The taxidermist's neighbors measured justice not in law, but in the stomach's comfort. He kept his head low and his pockets tidy, knowing that honesty, when too visible, could cost more than deceit. Still, rumors of that same noble family drifted even into the poorer districts. A hunting estate under investigation, a dismissed steward rumored to have hanged himself, and an animal of rare species said to be missing from a royal collection. He read these stories with a tightening in his chest, as if the lines on the page addressed him personally. One morning a parcel arrived without sender's name. It contained a small tin vial half filled with black dust and a slip of paper bearing 2 words, "You understand." He stared at the message until the lamp guttered out. The handwriting was unrecognizable, deliberate in its plainness. That night he hid the vial in the workshop wall behind a loose plank, then spent hours pacing in half light. Every noise, the snap of a rope outside, the creak of stairs, seemed to carry intent. He began walking more often after sundown. The harbor soothed him. Its sounds did not question. There, amid the clatter of chains and the rhythmic groan of masts, his mind drifted back to the idea of cause and consequence. Preservation, he thought, was not only a skill, but a mirror for life itself. One could keep forms intact, yet never restore what made them warm. The same rule seemed to govern truth. Once touched, it could only be arranged, not lived. When the spring rains grew heavier, the widow from upstairs visited again. She brought him boiled eggs and inquired almost shyly whether he had plans for midsummer. He thanked her, saying work made the days mild enough. She nodded, then stayed longer than usual, watching him glue feathers to a jay. A soft melancholy crossed her face. "You make them beautiful again," she said. "It's a kindness the living rarely get." He did not answer. Her words were too near the thought that had unsettled him all season, that perhaps his trade's stillness had begun to shape his own heart. Weeks turned. The city grew green along its canals, then humid and restless. News spread of another death in the north. A messenger found drowned near a bridge. The story was vague, yet details caught his attention. The body discovered with a sealed pouch missing. The location near lands he had once crossed. Soon after, a constable returned to his shop, not the same as before, but equally alert. "There are inquiries again," the man said. "Do you keep correspondences with northern estates?" "No," the taxidermist replied. "Only with suppliers of spirit and glass." The constable studied the room. "You work for collectors, I see. Such skill travels through rumor. Careful whom you serve. Some hands trade in more than specimens." When the door closed, the taxidermist steadied himself against the table. Outside, rain hammered the eaves. His ledger lay open before him, pages orderly and innocent. He turned them one by one as though any line might change beneath his gaze. But the real record, the private one hidden in letters unsent, remained beyond revision. The next evening he went to post another letter to his sister. The clerk, distracted by tallied fees, weighed it without comment. As he stepped from the post office, he thought of retrieving it, of tearing it up before delivery. But a weary impulse kept him still. Some truths needed to travel unseen. That summer he took fewer commissions, claiming illness. He spent longer hours observing rather than working. Cats hunting in alleys, gulls diving for refuse, men loading carts with crates bound for foreign ports. The movement comforted him. Everything alive sought purpose, fleeting and immediate, even amid decay. He envied that simplicity. One afternoon, while sorting pigment jars, he noticed a faint trace of black dust on the shelf, the same residue once found on the lynx's fur. He had not opened the hidden vial since receiving it, yet somehow its presence had multiplied, as if the idea itself could spread through matter. He brushed it away, though the motion brought no relief. That evening, he burned several of the unsent letters in the stove. The flames curled their edges into bright petals, devouring every careful sentence meant to confess, but never accuse. His sister died before autumn's end. The news reached him in a neighbor's shaky handwriting. There was no money for burial rites. He traveled to the poor quarter to see her resting place, a patch of frozen soil marked by a wooden cross without name. He stood a long while, his hat in his hands, and thought about all he had kept from her. Not lies, but silence. When he returned home, the city seemed strangely indifferent, its streets louder but less recognizable. Grief came not as tears, but as a dull steadiness in the chest, the same kind he felt when mounting fragile bones. For days afterward he avoided his tools. The jarred eyes on the shelf gleamed too brightly, like judgment. Then one night, unable to sleep, he uncovered the lynx. The lamplight slid across its pelt, revealing the artistry of his own hands. It looked untamed even in death. He traced the line of its stitched wound and almost admired how seamless it appeared. But a flaw caught his eye, a faint discoloration near the ribs, something he had missed months before. He leaned closer and saw what seemed to be ink beneath the fur. Gently parting the seam, he found a narrow scrap of parchment folded twice. The handwriting seemed the same as that on the anonymous note, deliberate, emotionless. The single line read, "What is alive does not forgive." He sat motionless until dawn, the paper trembling in his hands. Then, just as quietly, he replaced it where he had found it, and stitched the seam again, as though restoring the lie to its perfect form. He covered the lynx, washed his hands, and opened the window to the pale morning air. The city stirred outside, carts rolling, bells calling the faithful, vendors shouting prices. It all sounded distant, as if life itself were taking place one street away. He closed the shutters and sat at the workbench. The day would begin soon enough, with ordinary customers and ordinary questions. Yet nothing seemed ordinary now. Preservation had turned upon itself. It no longer protected memory, but imprisoned it. Still, he sharpened his knife and set to work. Habit, at least, remained faithful when truth could not. And so, in the dim quiet of that small room, the taxidermist bent once more over an unfinished bird. Outside, the rain began again, soft and equal. The sound filled every corner until even grief seemed to listen. Autumn returned with its brittle light, sharpening every sound in the city. The waves along the quays struck harder. The cries of gulls rang with hunger, and smoke from narrow chimneys drifted low and heavy. The workshop, too, had changed. Tidier, quieter, almost solemn. The taxidermist spoke little now, even to customers. He worked precisely, almost reverently, as if correcting some old error each time he lifted his tools. But restlessness followed him like a faint second shadow. The note he had found inside the lynx's body had not left his mind. The small piece of parchment haunted him with its calm accusation. What is alive does not forgive. Every day he tried to believe it had been a trick, a cruel joke left by an unknown hand, nothing more. Yet each time he brushed past the draped form of the lynx, his chest tightened as though the creature itself remembered. Winter announced itself early that year. By the first frost, the canals had stilled. Merchants complained of shortages, and rumors ran through the taverns that the noble family in the north had fallen under investigation. No official charges followed, only whispers. Papers spoke of missing ledgers, of estates abruptly vacated, of servants who had vanished across the border. Then came an invitation that startled him. A handwritten note sealed with a crest he recognized immediately. The same crowned elk within a thorn circle. The message was polite, formal, and impossible to refuse. He was requested to attend a private evening presentation at the residence of a certain Baron G, newly returned to Stockholm. The note added that the Baron had long admired his craftsmanship and wished to include one of his creations in a forthcoming exhibition for scholars and patrons of the natural sciences. The handwriting, fine and deliberate, bore the faint slant of someone accustomed to issuing commands rather than requests. He prepared as though for confession. The invitation named no specific piece, so he assumed they meant the lynx. It had stood too long under its sheet, as if waiting for such a summons. He packed it carefully, wrapping the form in linen and resin paper. When he touched the crate, the faint vibration under his fingertips resembled breath. The Baron's house stood near the high garden terraces overlooking the frozen bay. Lanterns glowed along the entrance road, each enclosed in glass to keep the wind from devouring the flame. Servants moved with the silence of trained ritual. Within, the corridors smelled of beeswax and damp velvet. Paintings stared down at him from the walls, hunts, trophies, frozen triumphs over nature. He was ushered into a hall where an assemblage of noblemen and scholars milled around tables heavy with brandy and cigars. Laughter lingered, polite and mechanical. The Baron entered with unhurried grace, a tall man in fine black cloth. The taxidermist knew the face at once. He had glimpsed it at the harbor the evening after the lynx had been delivered to his shop. The Baron spoke warmly, though his eyes carried an undercurrent of calculation. "You are the craftsman behind this admirable piece," he said, uncovering the crate with a practiced flourish. The lynx stood immaculate beneath the glow of chandeliers, more vivid than any painting behind it. A murmur moved through the assembled guests. Several stepped closer, admiring the poise and balance of the animal, its poised muscles captured mid-motion. The taxidermist listened without pride. Praise from power always concealed its own purpose. Later, as the conversation thinned, the Baron drew him aside to a smaller chamber lined with books. A silver decanter stood between them, untouched. The nobleman's voice softened, taking on the strange intimacy of those accustomed to both charm and threat. "You did more than restore it," he said. "You understood it." That sort of perception is rare and dangerous in the wrong hands. The taxidermist met his gaze but did not answer. He sensed that the man was not speaking about craft. The Baron continued, "There was trouble among my former stewards, poor management, regrettable disputes over property." I have been informed you took an interest in certain matters up north." He felt his pulse quicken, though his face betrayed nothing. "I travel for study," he replied. "So I assume," the Baron said, smiling faintly. "Let us say, for simplicity, that what occurred there has ended. The forest keeps its secrets, and I have reclaimed what was mine. Now, in a different light, we may admire the result." He turned toward the lynx, its glass eyes gleaming as though reflecting a hidden fire. The Baron's tone softened further. "Understand this," he said. "No good comes from stirring old soil. The past rewards silence far better than justice." He paused, letting the words hang like perfume in the air. Then he poured himself a drink and changed his voice to polite dismissal. "You've done admirable work. The Society of Natural Inquiry shall receive your name for recommendation. You may go." The taxidermist bowed, uttered some polite phrase, and left the hall with a calm that felt foreign to his limbs. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, thick and without hurry. His carriage driver glanced back, waiting for orders, but he signaled to walk. The house vanished behind him in a blur of white. Back in the city's lower quarter, sleep refused him. The image of the Baron, smiling in that perfect room, fused with the memory of the dead messenger and the ledger. The fragments had assembled at last into something unavoidable. He realized that the men who claimed dominion over forests and creatures also claimed silence from those below them, shaping life itself into display. He had mounted such illusions for years, innocence pinned beneath form. The awareness arrived with unbearable clarity. The next morning, a knock rattled the shutters. It was the same constable, looking unshaven and tired. "Strange business," he said. "The man who summoned you last night? There was an accident at the docks. Fell into the water returning from his carriage. Some say drink, others whisper of quarrel." The taxidermist felt every breath grow thin, though his voice remained steady. "Tragic," he managed. The constable gave a weary nod. "Tragic, yes, but convenient for someone. Papers gone, servants dismissed. Seems fortune buries her robes neatly when she walks away." When the officer left, the taxidermist sat by the covered lynx once more. The creature stared through the muslin like a secret barely hidden. He thought of removing the note still sewn within its ribs, but stopped himself. Whatever lived inside that silence had already done its work. To expose it again would serve nothing but doubt. For days, the city hummed with gossip about the Baron's death. Was it accident or retribution? Ice or intention? No one claimed certainty, though everyone believed what frightened them least. He said nothing. Clients came and went. The shop survived its ordinary trade, yet the air around him had grown clearer, as though something invisible had shifted. On the eve of December's first snow, he packed the lynx into a crate and took it to the museum where the exhibition had been planned. The curator, a nervous scholar with ink-stained hands, received it gladly. "A masterpiece," the man said. "Visitors will mistake it for living." He accepted the compliment in silence, signed no papers, and stepped back into the gray street. The harbor wind caught his scarf and filled it with salt. He walked until the lamps behind him blurred into golden mist. Though nothing in his life had outwardly changed, he carried the quiet knowledge that truth, like the creatures he worked upon, could not be destroyed, only rearranged until it resembled something bearable. That night, as he closed the workshop door behind him, he left the lamp burning. Its reflection glimmered faintly on every glass eye, soft and uncertain, as if waiting for a new shape of meaning to emerge from the stillness. By the end of that harsh winter, the snow on the roofs had turned gray and brittle, like the crust of some great forgotten meal. The harbor bells rang slower now, their tone dulled by fog. Word of the Baron's death had faded into the city's usual gossip. Only a few still whispered of an unseen hand, a quiet vengeance from the north, or the curse of the forest itself. The taxidermist heard these rumors at the coffee house, though he never joined in. Inside his workshop, time had become measured by smaller things: the slow burn of oil in the lamp, the tick of cooling wood, the interval between footsteps outside. He worked now as others might pray, steadily, without desire for reward. His tools were worn smooth, his fingers calloused but precise. Clients remained steady, though their visits felt spectral, voices from some distant world that demanded forms of beauty without knowing what sacrifices birthed them. The lynx no longer stood in the shop. After its delivery, he felt both relief and absence, as if some invisible tether had been cut. Yet the silence it left was not empty. It stayed in the room like air that had once held fire. He found himself reaching toward the space it had occupied, half expecting the sound of breath or the brush of fur. One afternoon the constable returned, this time without uniform. His coat looked older, the edges frayed. "I'm not here for law," he said. "They closed the inquiry. No culprit, no complaint. But something about it unsettles me." He sat by the stove, rubbing his hands near the faint warmth. "You knew the man," he said carefully. "I knew his servant," the taxidermist replied, which was close enough to truth. The constable studied him for a while, then smiled faintly. "Truth and patience," he said, "are the last refuges of craftsmen. But sometimes they kill slower than poison." When he had gone, the taxidermist looked over the shelves of preserved birds, each poised mid-song. The constable's words hung in the air. He wondered if patience indeed could rot like meat when kept too long. Stockholm's spring thaw came early, unstoppable once it began. Snow shriveled to ice ridges, and the canals turned to mirrors, showing the trembling reflection of smoke-stained skies. The museum announced the opening of its exhibition. Notices appeared on street corners. One morning, curiosity led him to visit. He entered quietly as a patron rather than exhibitor. There, under bright gas lamps, stood his lynx, raised upon a marble base, its head lifted proudly, glass eyes glimmering with captured hostility. Visitors stood in clusters, admiring it as a triumph of skill. "So lifelike," he heard one of them say. "Even the muscles seem to breathe." Another murmured how reassuring it was to see nature conquered, contained. He watched them for some time, then turned away. The admiration, harmless on the surface, sounded to him like the faint rustle of chains. Somewhere between death and display, between justice delayed and truth withheld, the meaning of his work had shifted. After that visit, he felt an odd emptiness settle in his chest. He began to clean the workshop obsessively, rearranging tools, dusting jars, and even repainting the shelves. Each action erased something of his old life, as if tidiness could absolve memory. Still, when night arrived, dreams came thick with symbols, forests without sound, broken glass eyes, a child's laughter from somewhere beneath the floor. Late in April, news spread that one of the Baron's former guards had been arrested for theft and drinking on duty. He was to be hanged near the northern gate. The taxidermist avoided the spectacle, but could not stop hearing of it. Some said the man confessed to trapping protected animals under noble orders, though the record omitted such details. When the execution bell rang across the city, it carried a tone different from sermons or weddings, thinner, stripped of sanctity. He found himself working through the sound. His hands kept steady even as the hammer struck beyond the walls. Afterward, silence returned so deeply that the ticking clock on the shelf startled him. He stopped, knife in hand, realizing that motion itself felt hollow without meaning. That night he burned his old notes, all those letters never sent, sketches of forests and ledgers, fragments of a truth now beyond reach. The paper curled swiftly, its ashes drifting into the air like moths seeking warmth. He expected relief, but what came instead was stillness. It seemed to him that destruction performed quietly and without hatred carried a kind of mercy that speech could never match. From then onward, work slowed. Days passed in a rhythm of minimal sound. Sometimes the widow from upstairs brought him food, saying little. On her last visit before moving away to join a daughter in another district, she left him a small loaf wrapped in linen and said, "You've given more life to the dead than most give to the living." It was not flattery. She said it like a farewell blessing. When she had gone, he stood at the window, eating a slice of the bread as snow began again, unexpected for the season, a brief white veil over the roofs. The scent of it reminded him of his first winter in the master's shop long ago. Sawdust, spirits, and candle smoke. That memory felt suddenly nearer to peace than any virtue earned since. He spent the following weeks finishing only small commissions. The tools grew dull. Spirits evaporated slower in the chill air. Sometimes he walked to the harbor simply to exist among noise, to reassure himself that life continued outside his narrow room. Sailors hauled crates, boys chased gulls, women bargained for fish. He listened to their quarrels and laughter the way one listens to tides, detached yet comforted by recurrence. But one evening, as dusk rose over the water, he saw smoke rising on the northern horizon. A whisper spread through the onlookers, a warehouse fire near the museum district. The flames leapt against the sky, their color deep gold turning to orange. Wind carried the smell of pitch and varnish, the signature of stored specimens and lacquered displays. The museum burned through the night. He watched from the quay until exhaustion drove him home. The sight did not stir shock, only a quiet recognition. A circle, closing where it began. When dawn came, he joined others wandering through the ruins. The marble plinth where the lynx had once stood was cracked in half, blackened, yet strangely elegant. Its plaque melted into unreadable shape. No one spoke of causes or fortune. Some said a careless servant overturned a lamp. Others invoked God's will against human pride. He told no one that he felt relief, that seeing ash fall over the charred foundations filled him with something almost gentle. What is preserved, he thought, must one day release its hold. That evening, returning through silent streets, he paused by a flock of pigeons settled near the river wall. One lifted its wings, scattering the soot that had fallen on their feathers. and for a breath of time it seemed the sky itself exhaled. Back in the workshop, he tidied what remained: burnt fragments of correspondence, worn brushes, a ledger reduced to half its pages. He placed them into a crate, carried it to the hearth, and struck the flint. Flames rose with patient grace, consuming years of careful record. The smell mixed oddly with the faint scent of herbs the widow had once hung to dry near the stove. When the last ash cooled, he opened the window. The wind moved through the room like a long-forgotten visitor, honest, unmeasured, carrying faint traces of salt and rain. It wandered across shelves, touched tools, and lifted one feather that had escaped from the basket. The feather drifted upward, circled once, then vanished through the open air. He watched it go without sadness. Outside, city lamps flickered one by one as darkness settled. A ship's horn echoed faintly through the fog, neither mournful nor hopeful, merely continuous, like breathing. He rested his hands on the windowsill, palms rough from labor, and listened until even the harbor quieted. The night held no secrets any longer, only the low hum of life continuing somewhere beyond sight, indifferent, yet tender in its persistence. He turned from the window, extinguished the lamp, and stood still for a while, surrounded by nothing, yet aware of everything that had passed through his hands. The ashes lay cool behind him, the feathers already gone, and the air trembled faintly with the memory of wings. Years passed quietly, as years often do when one no longer measures them by desire. The harbor aged with him, though he would not have said so aloud. Its timbers grew darker under the constant wash of salt, its cries and clatter subdued by habit. Even the gulls seemed lazier now, circling more from ritual than hunger. He still lived above the workshop near the quay, though the city around had begun to forget his name. The tools remained where they always had, polished by touch, dulled by years. Work came rarely but steadily, a falcon from a merchant's voyage, a stray hare from a city hunter. He no longer sought recognition. Craft itself had become his form of prayer. Patience had weathered him gently, rounding sharp edges into quiet understanding. He moved slower, but not with regret, each motion deliberate, sufficient, final. He woke early each day, not from duty but from habit, lighting the stove with tender economy. Coffee simmered with faint bitterness. Sometimes he stood at the window, watching smoke from the harbor drift over roofs like low clouds. He had long since stopped asking what might come next. Life, he had learned, moves sideways more often than forward. The mystery that had once consumed him, the lynx, the noble, the northern woods, had dissolved into something less distinct yet more lasting. He carried it now as one carries a scar, painless, instructive, a token that complexity exists whether spoken or not. He no longer wondered what justice meant, or whether truth once hidden should ever be unearthed. What remained was gentler, the wish to see beauty without the need to possess it. His reputation lingered faintly among museum curators and aging scholars who admired his restraint. Sometimes they sent letters, offering commissions he politely declined. His eyesight had begun to dim, and he preferred the company of things already at rest. Birds, mostly. Modest sparrows, robins, doves, creatures small enough to hold easily, to restore without ambition. The larger trophies had lost their appeal. They felt boastful, indecent, reminders of conquest rather than wonder. On certain afternoons, he took slow walks beyond the city's edge. The outskirts had changed. New mills, new chimneys. Yet in pockets of silence, the world felt much as it had in his youth. He would pause among the willows, noting each detail of the changing light, how the low sun touched the water, how reeds bent in patterns that suggested intent. Once, a boy passing by asked if he was an artist. He answered simply, "I make things look as they once were." The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding, and ran off toward laughter. When the evenings turned cold again, he began what he knew would be his final piece. It was a small bird, unremarkable to any eye but his, a waxwing found by a sailor's child near the wharf. The creature had fallen mid-flight, its body delicate as smoke, colors faint beneath winter light. He accepted it without charge, saying only that work like this was payment enough. The preparation took weeks. His hands no longer obeyed with youthful precision. Movements required care, pauses for breath. Yet there was pleasure in slowness. He trimmed each feather as though settling an argument between time and decay. The process reminded him of earlier seasons, of the long apprenticeship, of nights when he learned to listen to the silence between things. At times, while he worked, he sensed the past gathering as quietly as dust. The long corridor of memory opened. His master's workshop, with its smell of spirits, his sister's laughter fading behind a cough, the woman upstairs leaving her small loaf of bread. Even the noble's cold voice drifted faintly through the years, not as threat now, but as echo. All of them seemed bound together, threads of one long gesture toward understanding. The days shortened, and the first frost of the season whispered against the windows. He pulled his chair closer to the lamp, warmth radiating in a small, humble circle around him. When the bird stood finished on its perch, wings half lifted, as though caught between hesitation and assent, he felt no triumph, only a steadiness that bordered on grace. It looked neither alive nor dead, but something in between, like time itself, pausing for thought. That evening, he opened the window to let in the scent of snow. The city below murmured with distant footsteps, horses, the creak of wood. Across the water, lanterns trembled on the masts of anchored ships. Their reflections broke and reformed with each ripple, light stitched to darkness by unsteady water. He smiled faintly at the sight. Imperfection, he thought, was simply life refusing to remain still. He poured a cup of brandy, his one indulgence, and raised it to the room around him, to the tools, the jars, the feathers drifting along the shelves. The toast had no words, yet it carried meaning, a gesture toward all he had known and all he had lost. When he set the cup down, the waxwing seemed almost to watch him, its poised wings catching the soft breath of the wind. He left the window open through the night. In the half-dark, he dreamt of a forest without boundaries, one of light and motion, where every creature moved freely, unafraid. The sound of the sea blended with the whisper of leaves until he could not tell one from the other. Morning found him still seated, his face calm, hands resting loosely on his knees. The waxwing remained on its perch, the faint draft from the open window stirring its down. Outside, dawn spread across the harbor, washing the rooftops in a pale gold that softened every edge. People below began their usual labor, carts rolling, gulls calling. The city, faithful to itself, awakened again. And within the quiet room, nothing felt unfinished. The small bird stood firm in its gentle pose, not a symbol, not a monument, but an honest reflection of the man who made it. Outside, a flake of snow drifted through the window, landing beside the waxwing's foot before melting into nothing. The air settled, the light deepened. All things, for a moment, seemed to pause, as if remembering what they once were. Alive, unguarded, and enough. Then the wind stirred again, carrying with it the soft rhythm of wings, unseen but very near.